Okay, Ted Hollingworth, Williston class of 1951, living in picturesque Carlisle, Mass., just northwest of Boston, town rich in history, founded in 1754 and once a part of Concord. Ted has spent much of his career teaching. He's professor emeritus at Emerson College in Boston. He also taught at Harvard Extension, Babson College, undergrad and grad schools, as well as Stanford and UC Santa Barbara. He was also involved in consulting with, among many, MITRE corporations, Massachusetts DARE, New England Institute for Law Enforcement Management, ITEC, and the US government, where he was assigned to work with Gordon Welchman, who broke the Nazi Enigma code at Bletchley Park in England. This action is reputed to have saved 2 years in defeating Germany. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Ted Hollingworth, who will complete the Gordon Welchman story.
Thank you very much, Tex. I want to thank you and Corrine for all the work that you've done in preparing for this meeting here today. My work with MITRE, I always was a full-time teacher at Emerson College, but in that situation, I did have some time to work other places. And I was working full-time for MITRE in the summer for about 19 years. And then in the academic year, I would give about 12 to 15 hours a week at my discretion. And I was sitting in my office one day, my desk, and one of my friends and a group leader by the name of Billy Workman, who was from Texas, by the way, and a fantastic engineer. If you know MITRE, it was a think tank. It was a brain factory. When they first became MITRE Corporation, they had 600 MIT graduates there. And so he came in and he said, I have a new man working for me whom you should meet. I think he's rather unusual, but we're having some problems with his writing. We can't seem to be able to figure out exactly what he's saying. So we'd like to introduce you and see if you can help him. So we walked over and we walked in, and there was a very distinguished looking gentleman, I would say probably in his 60s at the time, and it was W.G. Welchman. And he was always dressed well. He had a suit on and had his suit coat on, and he was a great gentleman. You could tell right away he was very alert and very bright. And to make a long story short regarding that, he gave me one of his documents that he was writing, and he always wrote in longhand in pencil on colored paper. I'll show you some of that information a little bit later. So I took the paper and I went back and I sat down, and I wasn't through the first page when I said, I know what this guy's problem is. He uses too many run-on sentences. And I counted one in the first page that ran on for about 5 lines. So what would happen was, because his thinking was so intense, that he would start a sentence and take you in 2 or 3 or 4 directions before he finished the sentence. So I just simply went back and said, Gordon, this is really 3 sentences. You put a period here and you put one there and so forth. And automatically, he was much easier to read. And I read probably hundreds to maybe thousands of pages of his work. And I will say that I don't think I ever found a spelling error, and I never found like a punctuation error at all. So that's how it started. Now, I ended up coming out of that experience with some questions. And one of them was, who was Gordon Welchman? And another question was, what was Gordon Welchman's involvement in Bletchley Park? And another was, what happened to Gordon Welchman immediately after the war ended? And then what did Gordon do at the MITRE Corporation, where I met him? And what happened to Gordon in his final years? So that's what we're going to have a look at here. So quickly, let me point out who this gentleman was. Gordon Welchman was born in England. He was born in 1906, and his early years were from, I'm covering now, 1906 to 1939, which is when he went to Bletchley. He came from a clergy family. His father was Archdeacon of Bristol. He had an older brother who was killed in World War I. He also had a sister. Between 1920 and 1925, he was a student at Marlborough College. He was very good looking, very well liked, socially very popular. He was very athletic. He played field hockey. He was a renowned mountain climber. He was really dedicated and loved music. He played the trombone. He loved classical music and especially madrigals, and had a tremendous collection of tapes and records, which he kept methodical records on. His habits were, he loved to read, he loved new ideas, he loved details, and he was very curious. He went to Trinity College in 1925, where he was a math scholar, and he was first in his class in 1926. He became a fellow in 1929 at Sydney, Sussex, and he was very soon elected dean. As a matter of fact, he was in the middle of writing a book on algebraic geometry, which everybody in mathematics tells me only a few people would know what he was talking about or be even interested in the book, which I don't think he officially published until the war was over. And he'd also pretty much completed all the work necessary for a PhD at Cambridge, but the war stepped in. Now, one of his daughters, Rosamond, wrote a foreword to the book that you all should, if you're interested in, get a copy of and read. This is Gordon Welchman, the Bletchley Park's Architect of Ultra Intelligence, by Joel Greenberg, which is the best book that I've read on this individual and the history of that time. But Rosamond talked about him, that he was, this had a great impact on his family during the war, because he could not even tell his wife or family where he was. He just said, I'm going to work. And his wife became convinced that he was having an affair, which he was not. But they began to realize that their father had done something really important during the war, but they shouldn't talk about it. But they began to realize at the end and after the war was over that his leadership was very significant at Bletchley Park. He was a gentleman through and through, a true English gentleman. One of his favorite comments was, a gentleman thinks about it, but doesn't do it. He enjoyed life. He was inclined to be very positive. He had a twinkle in his eye. He had a very subtle smile. He was very polite and very accepting. But he could change his mind. He could change his ideas if he became convinced that they were better. And even if he didn't like someone, he would give them the opportunity to become liked by him if he developed a respect for them and so forth. So he wasn't frozen in thinking, which is very important as part of knowing who this man was. When he was interested in anything, he threw himself into it. He loved music. He had a huge record collection. He loved gardening. And his daughter said that he could take a rocky hillside and turn it into a beautiful garden all by himself. And he would move these monstrous rocks all by himself. One day he said to me, he said, I want you to come over to my house because I want to show you my roses. So we went over to his house at lunchtime, and he had these beautiful, beautiful rose bushes that seemed to me to be just planted randomly around his property. And I say, why are they planted all over the place? He said, it depends on the angle of the sun. And as we were walking down his driveway, there was a huge rock. I'd say about half the size of a Volkswagen. And he said, oh, I've got to move that rock. And I said, how are you going to do that, Gordon? And he pointed to a long handled shovel. And about a week later, I came back and that rock was moved. And he had done it all by himself. Now, his daughter said that he read Aku Aku by Thor Heyerdahl and Easter Islands and all the big statues. And that's how he learned to move these great big rocks. He was always curious. He loved to read. He loved new ideas. He had very methodical habits. For example, when he would leave his house to go on a vacation or something with his family, he would tick off step by step all of the things that one should do when they leave their house. And he was a guy that gave a great attention to detail. Okay, now he was at Bletchley Park from 1939 to 1945. He was recruited as one of the university types. And when he was asked if he would be willing to join Bletchley Park to defend king and country, he emphatically said yes. There were 4 university types at the time: Gordon Welchman, Alan Turing, Dennis Babbage, and John Jeffries. The problem that they were faced with at Bletchley Park in the Enigma Machine was how many times the Enigma Machine could be set. And listen to this, it was 1 million, million numbers of ways to reset that machine. It was huge, massive, massive problem, right? The Enigma Machine was actually invented in the 1920s and you could actually buy one. And then the Germans saw what it was and how they could use it. Now, Welchman, after he got to Bletchley Park, within a matter of weeks, he had already, come up with a key idea on how to break the code within a few weeks. It turns out that the Poles had been working on this before the Nazis, invaded Poland, and they had already come up with this idea. The irony of this is that the British did not know what the Poles had done until actually 1980. So they had no idea of this preliminary work that the Poles had been doing. Because what the Poles did when the Germans hit, the key people went to France, and they were involved with France during the war. Now, what they had come up with, however, that the insiders knew was it was possible to break the Enigma system. So the British approached this with the idea that we can break it. Now, one of Gordon's massive contributions at this particular time was traffic analysis. And he drew up a comprehensive plan to make that part of the process at Bletchley Park. He was the person who was responsible for setting up Hut 6. And Hut 6 primarily broke the Army codes and the Luftwaffe codes in World War II. And the way he set the company, the Hut 6 up, and eventually Hut 6, lasted all the way through the war. Turned out he was brilliant at organizing. He was brilliant at inspiring. He was brilliant at inventing. He was brilliant at just about every single thing he did. And as many people have said, and I'll give you some quotes later, he had an uncanny ability to look into the future and see the implications of something much, much clearer than anybody else. So if they were dealing with a problem right now, he could see what that was going to be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line. Now, one of the other very important discoveries and inventions at Bletchley was the development of the bomba, B-O-M-B-E. The Polish spelled it, by the way, B-O-M-B-A. And Alan Turing was very much involved with that. So it was Turing and Welchman that really kind of developed the bomba, which was a very, very brilliant, breakthrough. Almost as brilliant, probably as brilliant, was that they discovered that for this machine to process all of the incoming data that they were collecting, it would take sometimes 3 or 4 days before it was useful. So Gordon looked at that and came up with a new invention called a diagonal board, which speeded that process up by 6 to 7 times, which meant they could get the information and, read it and understand it the same day, as opposed to 3, 4, 5 days later. Now, what were the contributions, some of the key ones at that particular time from Bletchley Park? First of all, Bletchley Park sent out the message to the commanders at Dunkirk, get out. That was the message, get out. Their intelligence had figured out that they were about to be eliminated by the Nazi army, and they did get out. And that, of course, we all know about that. They moved 350,000 plus troops. And that's when all of the Brits that owned a boat along the English Channel jumped in it and went over and picked up as many soldiers or troops as they can, brought them back in, just kept going back and forth. I don't think that record was broken until 9/11, when the Coast Guard asked for help, getting people off Manhattan Island. And it was the largest flotilla in the history. And they moved over 1 million people, I think, in like 6 hours. That was phenomenal. But at that time, and another instance where Bletchley played a very important role, played an important role all the way through the war, but specific things. The Bismarck was the most advanced, battleship ever built in the world, named after Otto von Bismarck. It was a German, battleship. And they had been in a battle with the British Navy, and I think they sunk the Prince of Wales, which is the biggest British battleship they had. I think 5,000 men went down with that particular ship. And that's when Churchill said, sink the Bismarck. The problem was, where was it? Bletchley Park was able to figure it out where they were. And so the entire British fleet just concentrated on that area and began to try to bombard. The problem with the Bismarck was its cannons were so powerful, they could start shooting at you long before you got into range of them. But they were surrounded, and ironically, there was an aircraft. I don't even remember whether it was a twin aircraft, twin wing, double wing aircraft. And it was a torpedo plane, and it dropped a torpedo that hit the steerage of the Bismarck and damaged it so the Bismarck could only travel in circles. And it was just a question of time before they sunk it, because the British were just pounding it. There's still a discussion today as to whether or not the British armament, firepower destroyed the Bismarck, or whether the German sailors actually sunk it. And regardless, the Bismarck was sunk. Now, during this period, because of Bletchley Parks and the handling of the Enigma codes, the British were able to monitor the communication between Hitler and Rommel in North Africa. Okay? And one of the things that we all need to be aware of today, that when bin Laden was was recently discovered and assassinated by the SEALs, it was traffic analysis that Gordon development led to the discovery of where he was located. Now, moving on to some statements of what people said about him that were there at the time. There was Milner Barry, for example, said, quote, Welchman's originality of mind, strong mechanical bias, and imaginative vision were valuable assets presiding at the birth of an infant organization and planning its future growth. They moved from just a handful of people when they started Bletchley Park to over 8,000 at the end of the war. And Hut 6 had gone from a few people to 500. Another major event that happened in this time, at that time, Winston Churchill came to Bletchley Park in the fall of 1941, and he gave a rousing speech. Gordon was there. And immediately after Churchill left, Gordon sat down and wrote a letter to Churchill. And the signers of that letter were Welchman, Turing, Alexander, and Milner Barry. And when Churchill read it, he immediately contacted his highest ranking connection was General Isbay. And this is a quote: "Make sure they get what they want on extreme priority and report to me that this has been done. Action this day." That's one of the most important decisions ever made in history, right? And Welchman, again, as another quote from Harold Fletcher, always saw the long-term importance of things more clearly than anybody else. He also had the ability to separate his personal issues from professional issues. He could not really like someone, but if they were good, he could work with them. He could totally disagree with somebody on what they were advocating, but he would separate that particular bias if all of the other things that the person was doing were really the right things to do. By the way, he was very much in favor of hiring female, workers there. As a matter of fact, he hired two of the best himself. And this was a period when women were perceived very differently, which is ironic, because the Charles Babbage, the Englishman who built the differential calculating machine back in the early 19th century, is considered probably the introduction to the computer. He had Ada Byron, who was Lord Byron's daughter, by the way, do the first program for that machine. And then, of course, it wasn't debugged for about 100 years, but I remember one time talking with some of these people regarding some of these situations, and you would find there would be women. Grace Hopper was an admiral in the Navy, and no president of the United States would allow her to retire because she was terrific public relations, a great speaker. And I had the good luck to have been able to talk with her a couple of times. And one time I asked her about a very famous kind of unwritten story about her work. I think she was at Harvard at that time, and she had a problem with the computer, so she crawled inside. The computer was pretty big at that day, and Grace weighed about 100 pounds on a rainy day, and she found a moth in there. She pulled it out and stuck it in the logbook, and that's where debugging, the term, originated. And then, of course, one of the women that I've only learned in recent years about that was a brilliant code breaker too was a woman by the name of Elizabeth Smith. She was from Indiana. She was the number 9 of 9 children in her family, a Quaker family. And she did a huge amount of work in breaking codes during Prohibition, when the people trying to run, like alcohol and cigarettes and everything into the country. She helped the government really kind of capture and stop a lot of that traffic. But she also was able to work on the Enigma codes because she probably was responsible for keeping the Nazis from taking over some of these countries with their influence, especially in South America. Now, the irony of that was she married the top, code breaker in the United States, a man by the name of Friedman. And they were a team. And they were a formidable team. Now, he did a great deal of work in the Pacific with the Navy on breaking codes and so forth. But when the British were invited to come to Bletchley Park, 3 people came, and he was one of the 3, which I think is kind of ironical because his wife was really the expert on the Enigma. But because she was female, they didn't send her and so forth, which is, I think we've come a long way, thank goodness, in that area. But she was a tremendous a person when it came to breaking codes. Just amazing person. Now, post-war, after Bletchley Park, 1945 to 1962, Gordon was still really at the forefront of this new digital generation. He worked for Ferranti in Europe and in New York and so forth. In 1945, he was in New England. He came to the United States in 1948. And then he went back to England in 1954 because Catherine got homesick. She wanted to go back. He stayed there for a while, did work there. And then in 1957, he came to the United States where he was picked up at MIT. And he was picked up by Dr. J. Forrester, who was another giant of that era. And he was hired to do long-range planning at MIT. And so he left ITech, and he and Catherine got divorced at that time. It must have been difficult being married to, he was going back and forth between the countries and so forth. And he was so involved, of course, in his work. And he left ITech and joined MITRE in 1962. Now, during this time, he did get, he and Turing got awarded the Order of the British Empire. They were both being thought of as possibly getting knighted, but somebody pointed out because they technically worked for the British government at that time and were being paid by them, they weren't eligible. So they gave them each 200 pounds. But actually, I think recently I read somewhere that Great Britain has put out a new 50-pound note with Alan Turing's picture on it. Okay. Now, he liked raising his children in the United States. He liked the American education system, and he was very enamored with the case method. He thought that the people who were teaching in Britain were, especially in the business schools, were too theoretical. They needed to be more practical. And so actually, when he went through his second divorce, he married an artist. The first time he married a person was into music. The second time he married a person was into art. And they were kind of strange, kind of stressful situation. But when he decided, and he and his wife decided to get married, he gave me a call on the phone and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What do you want?" He said, "I need you to go to Cambridge with me." And I said, "Fine, okay." So he picked me up in his car and we're driving towards Cambridge. I said, "Where are we going?" And he said, "We're going to court." And I said, "Okay." A little while later, I said, "What for?" He said, "I'm going to get a divorce and I need a witness, and you're the witness," so forth. So we went through the process and it worked. He rarely ever said anything negative about anybody else, regardless of the situation. If he couldn't say something positive, he wouldn't say anything at all. So he just gave me just enough information so that I could be a witness and he could get the degree. Now, in 1962, he joined MITRE, which was only 4 years old at the time. Okay. Now, MITRE was a very interesting place. As I've said, they had 600 MIT graduates, but there's some very interesting people there. A good friend of mine, Dave Willard, was an engineer there that we're still friends today. He said he was walking through the corridor there one day and he overheard these two people talking about the fact that the United States during World War II had gotten a submarine into Tokyo Harbor, which was unbelievable. And it was such a remarkable feat that they made a movie out of it, and so forth. And as they were talking about it, another MITRE employee walked by and he said, "I was the commander of that sub." So you had these people around you all the time that were amazing. One of my good friends there survived the death march at Bataan and so forth, spent the entire war in Japan as a prisoner of war. Now, I was sitting there having lunch one day and I looked at my right and the individual still had the tattoo on his wrist that he had been in the death camps and survived. And on my left was a friend that I knew very well named Mike Pykopoulos, who was at MIT. And he cheated on his age, which he was 2 years younger than he said, and that he actually was in Patton 6 Army, which in the Massachusetts Armored Division, which suffered about an 80% casualty rate during that war. And he was actually at the spot when Patton jumped out of his Jeep and began to, direct traffic and so forth. There was another guy there and he was from Germany and his father was a minister in Germany. And he told his sons, he said, "Whatever you do, don't tell anybody about what we do. I'm going to teach you how to speak English, but don't tell anybody I'm teaching you." And he said one day his father said to his brother and to him, he took him by the hand, he said, "Come with me." And he went out to the backyard, went up a slope, a hill, and they looked out on the Autobahn. And he said, as far as they could see, 6 abreast were Sherman tanks, American Sherman tanks. And he said, that's the first time we realized that we were losing the war. And actually, Jerry's wife was a German interpreter, was actually taught by Hitler's personal interpreter, who never became a Nazi, refused to, but he was so good that they kept him. Being an interpreter is a lot more than just, say this word in English means this and so forth. You remember the kitchen debates between Nixon, and Khrushchev, when Khrushchev said, "We will bury you." And the US got all upset about that. The Allies got all upset about it. It was an old Russian peasant saying, which really meant we will outlive you and so forth. But that gives you an idea how important a translator is. But we were talking about World War II. World War II. And the discussion went on for about an hour. And there were probably about 6 of us at the table. And guess who didn't say one single word? Me. I was just listening to all these people who were there at the time. Mike had been caught behind the Nazi lines a couple of times. They're at the Battle of the Bulge, all these kinds of things. And I said, wow, I love history. I majored in it at college. And I said, this is great. Now, at the time he came to MITRE was about 4 years old. Another very important person who came from MIT at the time was Bob Everett, who was the project leader on World War II. This is a piece of the World War II. Okay? This is what we used to call a flip-flop. I'm not sure that it has a technical name. You can see a couple of vacuum tubes and a lot of wires and so forth. The rest of this is in the Smithsonian. It's a very big machine. And this could do one thing. And when I was lecturing on, the digital age to my students, I would bring that as an example and say, this could do one thing. And then I would take a chip and put it on my little finger and hold it up in front of them. This can do a million things. It's just the change in that period of time was extraordinary. Now, I think one of the reasons that MITRE hired Gordon was because of the work that he did at MIT. Oh, by the way, when he was at MIT, he taught the first computer course ever taught at MIT at that time in the Department of Electrical Engineering. Now, and also he had to become an American citizen, which he wanted to do at the time because of clearances. In 1964, he was transferred to a department headed by Eric Ellingson, whom was, in my mind, one of the best managers I ever met in that field. He was truly excellent. And he published an analysis of limited war environments, which became MITRE's authoritative statement up to 1980. This was all an outgrowth of the SAGE system, which was the North American Defense System. In 1965, he wrote another document on the limited war situations, which was published in Advanced Planning for all our command and control and tactical operations. And he worried about obsolete observations and so forth. But this was going through all kinds of acronyms at the time, SADI, Polaracta, JTIDS. And the interesting thing was that this man was responsible for a great deal of the vision on this particular project. 40 years of evolution to the current command and control system. Right? Now, I have actually got here a couple of really important documents that he wrote. These are not classified. This one, which was called a concept of selective access to tactical information. And I happen to write the introduction to that particular document because he was severely attacked for his approach at the time that the first draft of this document came out. And I actually felt that he was correct and all of the criticisms were wrong. And my approach was not technical. Mine was, you know, because I was a communication person and an organizational communication person. So we ended up, you know, going back and forth on that particular thing. I have somewhere here some examples of notes that we passed back and forth at that particular time. He also wrote another document called An Alternative to Air Strategy in Central Europe, a background study, which I remember sitting talking about that. And he was the kind of individual actually the purpose of that document was, what do we do if the Warsaw Pact nations attack NATO? Okay. And in sitting with this man, you would find you would be talking about Hannibal crossing the Alps with the elephants. And you figure, what's that got to do? Well, this guy was considered probably the greatest general in history. And we had to learn about how he arrived at his tactics and his strategies and so forth. But he had that kind of mind where he could take that very, very big picture. Now, I've mentioned B.J. Workman and the writing challenges and so forth, but I had another rather interesting experience. My next door neighbor was a man named Ben Benfield. And Ben used to love to have little gatherings, little parties in the afternoon. As a matter of fact, there was a moose in the neighborhood, used to come out in this field all the time at 4 o'clock. So we'd have moose watching parties. And I went down there one day and there's Gordon. And it turned out that they were best friends. And Ben said to me on the side, you know, your friend Gordon, we went to school together in England. And he is the guy that broke the Nazi codes in World War II. And I said, you're crazy. I said, we work together all the time. We both have top secret clearances. He never mentions it. He said, well, he's sworn to secrecy, but I'm not. And pretty soon the Secrecy Act will run out, about 2 months, so forth. And 2 months later, I could hardly wait to get in to confront Gordon because officially the Secrecy Act had run out. And I said, Gordon, were you at Bletchley Park? He said, yes. He said, were you at Hut 6? He said, well, yes, I'm the guy who was the head of Hut 6. And we broke the Nazi codes. And I'm going to write a book about it, and I want you to help me. And that was the end of that. We were off to that. By the way, another cute story that Ben told me. At one time, he worked in the physics department at Harvard, and his first job was to interview the freshmen before they went in to use the lab. And he said, I was interviewing this young man. And he said, within 10 minutes, he said, this young man is smarter than I am. I said, who was that young man? He said, Henry Kissinger. He was really very interesting, had a great sense of humor. He got divorced from his second wife, as I pointed out. And we talked about the gardens and so forth like that. I also, what I did not realize at the time, that financially, towards the end, when he got in trouble with both the British and American governments, and because of the book that he wrote, he financially was having some issues. So I brought him, I've always been in the fine art and antique business on the side. So I brought in a friend of mine to come in and purchase some of his things. Also, we got very involved with police communications. I was teaching at the New England Institute of Law Enforcement Management on the Babson campus at that time, command level, it was command level. And he said to me one day, can you get me a ride in a Boston police cruiser on a Saturday night? And I said, I don't think that's legal, Gordon, but let me try. And I'll stop there. I won't tell you anymore. But what that pointed out was that he wanted to really get into what was going on and who was doing it. He didn't want to talk to the commanding level. He wanted to talk to the working level. At one time, he called me and he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, what do you want? He said, I'm going up to Nashua, New Hampshire, to the Air Traffic Control Center. That's where they vector all the aircraft in from Europe. And I want to sit up there with the air traffic controllers and listen to them. So I said, sure. So up we went in there and so forth. And we're sitting there. I remember it vividly because I remember one foreign voice, with an accent, came over loud and clear saying, ladies and gentlemen, if you look down, you will see Cape Cod, and so forth. So it actually was very, very interesting. But the point was that that's what he did. He wanted to find exactly who the people were at the point of action and listen to what they needed and what they did. Now, when one day he gave me a call and he said, Ted, I want you to go with me. And so we went to a bookstore and he said, my book is released now. It's the boxes are here. And he pulled the first copy of the Hut 6 story out, wrote something in it, which I didn't even see. He put it and he handed it to me and I stuck it in my suit coat pocket, and the FBI raided the house and they confiscated all the books. They were never banned, but I think it was too late, but they wouldn't let him promote them or anything else. Both governments, Great Britain and the United States in security, really went after him to the point where he lost his security clearance, which means he could not work for MITRE anymore. It was a very, very difficult period. He, at that time, had met a young woman who was Bavarian and very, very distant relation on one side. Father was Bavarian and mother was English. She was 30 years younger than he, and they fell in love. And they got married. And I will tell you, it was one of the sweetest, most honest marriages that I've ever seen. I actually said to her one day, he'd gone out of the room to get some tea or something. I said, you know, Gordon's a lot older than you are. And she said, listen, she said, one day with this man's worth a year with anyone else I know. So I said, oh, okay, I'll stay out of that. And then we were working at the end of his career there on seeing if he could teach in what was called the MITRE Institute at that time. It was kind of like MITRE's own personal college. And I have some of the papers that we passed back and forth on that. And the most important note that I ever got to him, this is very selfish, but when he said, can I teach a course with Ted Hollingworth? And I was so touched by that. It was kind of like the mountain to Mohammed, you know, period in your life. I began to think about that and say, this individual was being very badly treated by both governments at that time, and he was kind of desperate to keep involved there. As a matter of fact, I have a couple of very interesting things that I will quote from the book here. This is Gordon here. He says, here again, I run into frustration. What I want to contribute twofold. First, my evaluation of what is seriously wrong with our military R&D, particularly not exclusively in the area of communication, but in the area of communication, intelligence, and security. And secondly, my ideas on what could be done to improve our military preparedness. His whole idea was that when you go into peace after war, you kind of dismantle everything. And what you're going to need is a group of people who don't do that. They keep going. They keep breaking codes in other countries and so forth. Now, he said, these are highly sensitive matters. We do not want to broadcast our weaknesses to potential enemies. Consequently, the contribution that I'm uniquely qualified to make can be made only in an environment in which secrecy can be effectively maintained. Yet, as Turing was prevented from making further contributions to cryptology because he was regarded as, quote, a security risk, so am I prevented from contributing to our future national security for the same reason. It also seems to be a waste. Now, there's a very interesting piece in here, and I'm going to read this to you if you don't mind. And it's about the German attitude towards Bletchley Park. Let me just read this. The success of Bletchley Park was in many ways so astonishing that many German officials who survived the war refused to believe that it had actually happened. In 1983, Welchman's nephew invited him to meet a work colleague in the American aerospace industry. His colleague was a German by the name of Karl Kober, a brilliant man with 2 doctoral degrees. Kober had been brought over by young American space program from a French prison after the war and turned into a space engineer. He had he had been a leading figure in Germany, and here he was, now a respected NASA scientist, sitting across a kitchen table from one of the people who had made a significant contribution to Hitler's downfall. The discussion was lively and quite remarkable. Kober completely denied even the possibility that Britain had ever broken the Enigma code. According to Welchman's nephew, Kober got quite heated and was adamant and not to be convinced otherwise. Welchman appeared to be quite calm and almost bemused to see his former enemy unwilling to accept the evidence before him. It was amazing kind of thing.
Ted,
yes.
Ted, sorry to interrupt you. I'm just mindful of time here. We have about 10 minutes left, and I do want to allow a discussion and time for questions.
I've got just a couple of minutes and I'll pull it together.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Gordon Welchman, an amazing individual, as I hope that I've convinced you, very prolific writer. The last years of his life were very tough. He was not well physically, and he was being harassed by both the British and American governments at the time. I benefited so much from this man. My students benefited so much because I brought him in as a speaker. MITRE benefited, Bletchley Park benefited from, the world benefited from this man. Okay. Unfortunately, it's too late for him to see that we finally recognize who he is. But I'd like to end by telling you just a personal thing. I used to say to my wife, I'm having lunch with Gordon today. I'll be smarter when I come home tonight. And I said that just to be cute. But over time, I began to realize that's really true. That this was the kind of man that you hang around with because you're smarter. And he was a wonderful man. He was the right person at the right place at the right time. And I think that it's sad we don't recognize that. Thank you.
Ted, thank you. That was a wonderful conclusion to a wonderful presentation.